Today we'll talk about the construction of the Château of Versailles by Louis XIV. Versailles was first mentioned in 1038 as a small farming village. In the 17th century, an abandoned small castle and mill could be found in the village of Versailles. Most of the land and property belonged to the local Gondi family. Louis XIII, who often visited the region for hunting trips, occasionally spent the night in the old abandoned chateau. In 1623, the king had the mill replaced by a small hunting lodge. The lodge was so small that it did not even contain rooms for the queen. After the king acquired the Gondi property in Versailles, he had the building expanded to a three-winged hunting lodge. The dilapidated old castle was demolished. The new Versailles hunting lodge was built in the style of the early French baroque, and it forms the core of the complex to this day. After the death of Louis XIII, the building passed to his son and successor Louis XIV. After Louis took over the government in 1661, the young king regularly resided in Versailles, which initially served him primarily as a summer residence and where he had large court festivals held. Finance Minister Nicolas Fouquet probably provided one of the main reasons for the expansion of the palace. With the Château Vau de Vicomte, Fouquet had a sensational castle built, which instigated jealousy and anger in Louis XIV. Louis suspected that Fouquet had financed the château to a large extent with funds taken out of the state treasury. He accused his minister of treason and had him arrested. After Fouquet had been removed from Louis's court, Louis consulted Fouquet's architects and commissioned them to expand his father's small castle. Contrary to the advice of the finance minister Colbert, who recommended tearing down the old hunting lodge, Louis refused to give up the old building, so it was integrated in the plans for Versailles. In 1668, building works for the first expansion of Versailles commenced. In 1677, the king announced that Versailles would be the future seat of government. More necessary expansions were made, and the court moved to Versailles in 1682. After the court had moved, over 22,000 people worked at and in Versailles. According to some sources, the number of workers even reached 36,000 in 1685. Between 1661 and 1663, more than 1,500,000 livres had been spent on the castle. The hunting lodge of Louis XIII had cost a total of just 300,000 livres, of which 213,000 were used for the lodge itself and a further 87,000 were needed for the gardens. In the period from 1664 to 1688, an average of 1 million livres was put into Versailles each year. By the time the Sun King died, 300 million livres are said to have flowed into the Versailles buildings, the park, the furnishings, and maintenance of it all. In comparison, the pension for families of workers who died in accidents while building Versailles averaged to 40 to 100 livres. The gardens are based on the garden plans designed by Jacques Boissiot de la Baroderie for Louis XIII. The gardens as we know them were largely created in three sections by André Le Nôtre. For the irrigation of the gardens, a system of artificial lakes, aqueducts and water pipes had to be developed. A large pumping device called the Marly machine was built. The device transported the required water masses to Versailles. The pipe systems supplying the gardens were over 160 kilometers in length. Nevertheless, the fountains and basins still did not receive adequate water due to the limited technical means available at the time, and the fountains could not all be in operation at the same time. Hence, during the king's walks, the fountains which the king passed were activated one at a time until the king was out of sight, at which time they were shut down again. There are several smaller buildings which one can visit in the gardens of Versailles: the Grand Trianon, the Petit Trianon, and La Mode de la Reine. The spacious garden palace, Le Grand Trianon, dates back to the time of Louis XIV. It was originally reserved for the king and his family, but over the years it had also been made accessible to all other nobles of the court. The neighboring Petit Trianon was built by Louis XV for his mistress, Madame de Pompadour. However, de Pompadour died before the completion of the building. Louis XV's successor, Louis XVI, gave the building to Marie Antoinette, who had it lavishly furnished. The Queen also had an artificial village built there, the so-called Hamlet of the Queen. All of these buildings were erected half an hour's walk away from the main buildings to allow the royals to relax and unwind away from the crowded palace. The city of Versailles, which was originally an insignificant town, gradually developed in front of the palace. The city was completely dependent on the opportunities provided by the château. Cooks, bakers, tailors, carpenters, and others settled there. Also, a large number of servants lived in the city. In time, the population of Versailles rose to more than 100,000 people, but the population rapidly declined when Louis XVI was forced to move to Paris in 1789 at the start of the French Revolution. In the 17th century, France was the most powerful state in Europe and, under the influence of the Sun King, the nation had become the continent's cultural, economical, and political center. Versailles was an expression of France's efficiency and a symbol of its greatness and strength. The orderly nature of the gardens was a reflection of the order that Louis XIV brought to the country. This concludes part 1 of my series on Versailles. For more information about Louis XIV or Marie Antoinette, you can click on the playlists you see in the links right now. Next week, we'll talk about life at Versailles. Be sure not to miss it. See you then.